Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. It's broadcasted live at delphi.ru and at the Facebook page of the Eastern Europe Study Center. And today we have four panelists with us. The coordinator of regional teams of Alexei Navalny, who communicated with high-level representative of the European Union, Mr. Volkov. Today we also have Andrius Kubilius, who is the member of the European Parliament and the standing rapporteur on Russia. The Chatham House expert Nikolai Petrov, and analyst and journalist, well known in Lithuania, Konstantin Eggert. Before giving the floor to our today's panelists, I would like to phrase one question to all panelists. May political opponents of Andrius Kubilius forgive me, but I think many would agree that Mr. Kubilius is not only a politician, but also an outstanding analyst on Eastern Europe countries and co-author of the so-called Marshall Plan for Ukraine, not only the standing rapporteur on Russia at the European Parliament. So Andrius Kubilius believes that at this stage it's very important to convince the West that the political change in Russia is possible, really possible, not only in some remote future. So since approximately 2008, since the times of war in Georgia, we've been hearing quite frequently that the days of Putin's regime are counted. It was repeated at those times, and during the Ukraine conflict and the Crimea occupation, many said that these are last days and last years of Putin's regime, but as we know, many days have passed, and we don't know how many yet will have to pass. My question is whether we have a certain firm preconditions to assume that Putin's rule is about to expire and face a serious crisis, and can we actually state that the days of this regime are counted? It's time to state the main points for each presenter, 5 to 7 minutes, and the whole time for discussion is 60 to 70 minutes. If you don't understand Russian, you can use the interpretation button and choose the English channel. I would also ask our speakers not to speak too fast so that interpreters don't have too much gray hair and cope with the interpretation. And as today our main working language is in Russian, we will go by the Russian ABC, and I'm giving the floor to Mr. Volkov. Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all discussion participants. It's really interesting for me to participate in this academic format, which is a rare luxury in our times. Mostly we're working in very practical politics. 3 hours ago, I came back from Brussels, where I was doing practical politics, and here we have a more academic format and more academic question. So how about the collapse of the regime, which is predicted since 2008? I would say that I never predicted the collapse of this regime soon, and none of us from our team did. So statements like this year for sure, never have we never found them appealing, and we think that this is a wrong approach. I think they are misleading, giving some wrong expectations, and then bringing disappointment and wrong emotional background. Putin's regime still has certain resources, a lot of security officers, quite a lot of money. They are quite okay with the financial system, quite okay with rating. They have the control over the electoral system. So there is no clear precondition for this regime to collapse immediately this year or collapse because of some mistakes. It does commit mistakes, and this regime is highly inefficient, corrupted, etc., etc. Which doesn't mean that it will collapse this year or next year. And we've always been thinking about it in planning our strategy. We were guided by the assumption that Putin is for long. Since 2011, it became clear that for very long, it is when the so-called reshuffle took place, when we found out that Putin wants to stay forever. And in 2014, this previous decision of Putin became irreversible. Between 2011 and 2014, he still could come back and change his mind. Like, okay, I don't want to stay forever and go and retire peacefully. But after military crimes in 2014, it's no longer an option for him to retire. So staying in power forever, it's about personal survival and personal safety for him. So we're still living in this feeling that Putin's decision is that he's forever. Is it a reason for us to give up? Of course, no. He tried to kill Navalny with Novichok, but he failed. He promised to pay double salary to doctors, double above the average in their regions. This is the well-known edicts of Putin, and he failed. Putin also decided and promised that the Russian economy will join top 5 of world economies, but he failed again. So the very fact that Putin has decided something is, of course, important for us to understand certain processes, but definitely it's not inevitable. So yes, we know that his decision is to stay and rule forever, and we know that he has a certain margin of safety, but which is not a reason for us to do nothing and just give up. So our long-term strategy is that we have to grow and become increasingly big political organization, so that in critical time, when for whatever reason this critical time comes, to appear as the well-organized and the best organized political organization in the country, and to demand change, demand free and fair elections, and that we are ready for peaceful transition of power. When will this moment come? We don't know. But we are sure that Putinism will not surpass Putin. Putinism is built on a network of personal context. Someone served with someone in Dresden. Someone grabbed Petersburg fleet in 90s, or killed someone together in mid 90s. So built on these personal relations, some dacha neighbors, or serving together in the same KGB department, or being members of the same criminal gang. So based on these personal connections and personal networks, we have this huge network of interrelations, mutual obligations, services that Putin is balancing. But this system can only live as long as Putin stays sane and sound. And if Putin goes, the system goes. For sure, we will have a lot of fights among these supporters, and we will have this fight, and this will be a great moment for all of us to step in and to say enough is enough, and to say that we are strong enough and we don't want it anymore. So based on that, we are planning our long-term strategy. We have to grow, we have to be stronger. This is why we reach out to regions and we develop new media formats. So the main measurement of our strength and political capacity is to how many people we can reach out and how many people we can mobilize. So we had hundreds of thousands before the presidential campaign of Navalny, while the presidential campaign and expansion to regions enabled us to reach out to millions. And after the presidential campaign in spring 2018, Our key audience constituted about 4 to 5 million people. So if Alexei wanted to say something, to deliver some message, 4 to 5 million could read it or hear it or see it in 1 or 2 days. So now, after this dramatic poisoning story and the investigation into the poisoning and several years of this work, years after the presidential campaign and after the Putin palace story, now this audience is 15 to 20 million. It is still smaller than the TV audience, but it's already comparable. So now we have the direct communication channel to 15 to 20 million Russians who are guided by us, who are supporting us in a certain degree. Some are more engaged, donating, protesting, others just watching on social media. But in the long run, if we observe this development, we see that this structure and this movement has grown in previous 10 years since the beginning of our work by about 50 times. And this growth, well, I think only Elon Musk can praise better growth with Tesla. So no matter how dramatic these events look for us, it's not a reason for us to say that that is the end of everything, or that we hope that Putin goes tomorrow. So we don't have, it's not within our control when he leaves. It can happen for biological reasons, since none of us lives forever, or it can be an effect of some palace coup or conflict when his entourage becomes unhappy with him, or it can be some black swan or any other unexpected events like Arab Spring, which came as a result of some accidental and not very important events in Tunisia, but it really blew up the situation. So we can't understand which of these three scenarios materializes. And of course, we don't want to wait for the biological scenario, since it may take very long. And of course, we don't want to wait for too long. So we have to increase the probability of two other scenarios, such as the palace coup, the elite split by influencing the elites and their interests, or this black swan scenario, some popular scenario, by using certain weaknesses of the regime. So this is what we call this black swan scenario, like big investigations, big failures of Putin, so we can use it for growing our movement and for strengthening our message, for protesting and mobilizing new supporters. So it's a strategy which takes patience, commitment, and building the network is really an ambitious task, but we are sure that it will bring about success. Already now, we are the second political force in the country, or maybe actually the #1 political force. We're already equal to Putin's party and his apparatus and his political organization by rating and participation opportunities. This is why they don't allow us to run at elections. But if we continue in this way, I'm sure that our political domination will become a fact.
Спасибо, господин Волков. Сейчас слово предоставляется господину.
Thank you, Mr. Volkov. Now we'll give the floor to Mr. Andrius Kubilius, and Nikolai Petrov is preparing. Thank you, Vladimir. It's really good to see the familiar faces, especially Leonid, whom we saw on Monday last time in Brussels. And Konstantin is sitting with some palaces on the background. But Nikolai, we also know him, though don't meet that often. Especially thank you to Vladimiras for naming me an analyst. Thank you for such words as well. So I would like to briefly review our initiative and our idea and how we see the whole picture of development of Russia in the eastern part of the European continent. I'm a standing rapporteur on Russia, and we are working on the so-called report on EU's policies on Russia and reviewing this policy. And I've also created an informal forum, the Friends of European Russia, in the European Parliament. Many have already participated, and this is a good platform for exchanging views and ideas. And I'm also the head of the Parliamentary Assembly on Eastern Partnership. So my profile is quite Eastern perspective of European and regional affairs. So first, I would like to say that while answering the question of Vladimiras, how much will Putin's regime last? Like Leonid, I will not say tomorrow or in 2 days, but I think there is a whole range of historical, objective phenomena and I think that this regime will have no place in Russia in a certain time. Maybe it will not happen accidentally, and we don't know how it will happen. But I'm sure that it will really happen. So I see three main factors as of now. First, the change in Belarus, which we saw since last year. Second, the visit of Borrell to Moscow and how much it changes the perspective of Putin's regime in the European Union. And third, that along with Navalny case and what the government is doing against Navalny, ranging between attempted killing and arrest, we should also see the upcoming Duma election in September. And this is the question that I raised from the beginning. This parallel between Belarus and Russia is an indication that phenomena in Russia are starting very similar to what we had in Belarus last year. The public protest is visible. As surveys indicate of people speaking for core change or big change inside the country, both in Belarus and in Russia, the share is very similar, about 60%. In Belarus, maybe slightly more. The regimes react in a very similar way. As we said with Mr. Navalny and Mr. Milov, that Putin is learning from Lukashenko, and we can see a very similar process. After Borrell's visit to Moscow, in the European Parliament and also in other institutions, we see growing understanding that sticking to business as usual with Putin's regime is pointless. Believing that Putin's regime can change, we can't be that naive anymore. And this understanding is growing, and more people believe that if change toward democracy is starting in Belarus, it can also start happening in Russia. So the European capitals and their understanding, which prevailed for a long time, that democracy is impossible in Russia. This is what Putin wanted. This is what he wanted to communicate to others, that Russia is a special case, that Russia never had democracy and it will never have democracy. The Tsar, the Secretary General, or the President, it's all the same. But now on the West, I see the emerging understanding that democracy is possible in Russia. We don't know how long it will take, but this is also a question of how the West can help the transformation of Russia towards democracy. And in this regard, I believe that Lithuania can play an important role to try to help the West understand the role that the West can play in this highly important shift. After Borrell's visit and our discussion in the European Parliament about the future, my point was that it's important to review European Union's policies towards Russia. We have to review the 5 principles which lead to selective engagement, according to which Nord Stream 2 is okay. So my message is simple. We need a clear vision what we have to do straight ahead, such as Navalny sanctions. Navalny sanctions had to be passed yesterday. Next step, we should see the parliamentary elections upcoming and how we can stop Putin from stealing this election the same way Lukashenko did. And the proactive sanctions to preempt it. And the next step is what I call the long-term strategy of the European Union on helping transformation in Russia, the so-called transformation strategy. So in this, we see an important factor of strengthening cooperation between the European Union and the United States, and to have a joint strategy. The strategy vis-à-vis Russia, and where EU can be more successful and more effective, creating the success area in Eastern Partnership countries, especially countries interested in advancing towards the European Union, such as Ukraine and also Georgia undergoing crisis now, and Moldova. Belarus can also make a strong turn in this direction. So the example of this success is also important for the long-term strategy vis-à-vis Russia. And the last thing that I would like to name, that the EU should have the strategy now, different from the selective engagement strategy that it is having, but the strategy for relations between EU and democratic Russia, such as free trade and visa-free movement and all other tools. They should be pronounced now to show a clear perspective and showing the future, a different future to Russian citizens if they undertook this uneasy transformation path. But this path is uneasy but unavoidable. And I believe in one of the political books. As a formal physicist, I read about politics, Samuel Huntington's The Third Wave. So in this book, Samuel Huntington showed that democratization of countries is occurring in ocean waves. The first wave, the countries covered by the first wave sometimes don't survive as democracies originally, but if we had 3 waves, the 4th wave will also come. And if we see the cycle, approximately this is the right time for the fourth wave to start. So we are waiting for this fourth wave. Well, it's not only about waiting, but also about working towards actually seeing this wave happen.
Слово сейчас вам, господин Петров, и готовится господин Eggert.
Thank you. The floor goes now to you, Mr. Petrov. And Mr. Eggert is getting ready. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in such an interesting discussion. I will start with answering the moderator's question. And I'd like to say that the regime is in crisis and its days are counted, and there are two ways out. Number one, the regime can change itself, not only use the resources, which are multiple at hand, but I mean that the regime can change, and that would be an out from the crisis. And the second way out is its collapse. I am not sure that whatever replaces Putin's regime is better than the one we have now, due to one simple reason, namely, in order to develop normal or good democratic institutions, we need time, years and years, and practices, which we don't have in Russia, neither normal or standard democratic elections, etc. We do not have this experience, this practice and skills of democratic practices. And even under good conditions, they will need many years to develop. Having said that, I'd like to note that the regime is changing itself. And it will be different in the near future because it aims to retain the government of Putin post-2024. Therefore, the changes in political design, which are quite abundant, are taking place. I mean, new institutions are being developed and a new structure of governing is getting developed, which would allow Putin to retain control over everything that takes place without meticulous stepping into things every day. Regretfully, this trajectory, which was under implementation since the beginning of the last year, it was mostly derailed and leave alone the recent events. And I believe that Mr. Navalny made a real blow to the regime. And irrespective of the abilities of Mr. Navalny being imprisoned, to take a real part in the developments in the country, we can see there is an erosion. From in 2 to 3 months, the level of support to Mr. Putin went from 32 to 29%. So actually, it's irreversible. And basically, it means that the regime needs to reinforce its repressive character. So far, the regime is defending itself from the challenges faced, and therefore, Putin is delaying his presidential message. And it's not clear what should that message should be today. We see local wind whirls, which are quite strong today, and actually they are not enough to take Kremlin's attention from the film and other things that have become topical. And it's not enough to basically split the support to Mr. Navalny. We have seen a letter by Mr. Yavlinsky and the decision on Amnesty International and many other things. And we can see that certain results of these activities, of this work, is already seen, especially in the context mentioned by Mr. Kubilius in the context of upcoming Duma elections. Well, about half a year ago, Mr. Navalny was supported in, let's say, dozens of electoral counties. And single member or single candidate electoral counties are used in order to reduce, one-seat districts are used in order to reduce the risk to the regime. However, today, the regime is much higher, has a much higher risk due to the smart voting model, due to what happened recently, and due to the lower support to the United Russia Party, which has currently the majority of seats in the Duma. However, starting with September, the situation may change to a major extent. It may lose the majority, it may even lose the constitutional majority, and it has to work together with other parties. And even if we have a protest vote, it may be quite significant in terms of one-seat districts and party list election, voting, sorry. We shouldn't expect revolution in Russia. It will not happen, but we should expect a very serious evolution of the political regime. And as I've mentioned earlier, it may lead to two key results. Either the regime will change and will become more complicated compared to how it looks today, and it will survive through change, or it will not be able to change, which may also happen, and it will collapse, and it will be replaced by another regime, which regretfully may not be necessarily democratic, and we will then see long years of building democracy. And I hope that we will go forward in this way, in the first way. Thank you. Now the floor goes to Mr. Eggert, Konstantin. Thank you so much, Vladimir. Thank you to the Eastern Europe Study Center. Mr. Prime Minister Kubilius, whatever you see behind my back is actually the Tishkevich Palace in Palanga and the panoramic picture of which, related to what colleagues have said before, I basically can support it, but I would like, instead of reiterating the same things, I would like to follow up on what Mr. Nikolai Petrov said at the end, just to illustrate it. I talked yesterday to a Laučius-style writer yesterday, who is quite popular in Russia, and he talked about his novel, which was ready for publication in December. However, due to technical reasons, they could not publish it. However, today, due to the change of the situation, the publishing house holder said that he's taking a few days whether the novel should be published about the regime. Basically, it's a very good illustration that Russia is really frightened, especially among the government circles. Basically, there was, and they have to survive. There was a Russian movie, The Order is to Survive. That's the same thing. So basically, we have two ways forward. Election to the Duma, which is not a normal parliament, but what will happen in Moscow and the regime, basically. First of all, what we see is repressions and full repressions, full destruction of the network of headquarters over Russia and throughout Russia that was created by Mr. Volkov and Mr. Navalny, so that there's lower risk during voting. Number two, there will be efforts to buy certain, let's say, favorite voting from the population, not 500 billion Russian rubles, but there should be some sum of money allocated for it in order to remind people that the government takes care of them, the authorities take care of them. And there will be very strong PR PR campaign in order to gain support. But I believe that Putin is afraid of local leading politicians because they are the points of where, let's say, free thinking and initiative develops. And now it's unclear what could be done currently in terms of foreign policy. Well, one option is sewing up in terms of relations with foreign countries. And based on Levat Center research, Russia has certain accumulated fatigue because of those tense relations with the West. That could be used as an argument by Kremlin in order to somehow lower down tensions. And of course, friends of Putin to the west of Oder River, they can start talking about perestroika number 2, which will be used, and similar things. Another scenario, which is also possible, is the scenario of raising tensions, namely the clash against the European Court of Human Rights. This could be a way to exit from the Council of Europe, to reintroduce the death sentence and be a demonstration of muscle, showing we are not afraid of anything and anybody. Again, another option is reintroducing of military action against Ukraine, and based on signals received from Kremlin, it could be the recognition, the legalization of what's happening there, like some legal steps that could be used in order to show that Russians are attacked and we are saving Russians. To some people in Kremlin, this could look quite attractive because the opposition could be asked a question, including Alexei Navalny's supporters. How what's your opinion about it? If you are against, then you are Russian phobia. You have Russian phobia, and if they say for, they can say that, yeah, you see, they're supporting Putin, who works for the benefit of the nation, of the population, even those who were yesterday against Mr. Putin. I believe the propaganda machine will work very strongly, especially taking into account what we hear in Donetsk among MPs, and about how cutting corners Mr. Doskis said. It could be said, it could be perceived as a theoretically possible option. On the other hand, it could be like tickling the nerves of the West. Otherwise speaking, Kremlin may say that if you don't behave yourselves with us, then we will smash all your dishes and please behave. On the other hand, that's a short-term perspective. Now, regarding long-term perspective, the political regime will not, I believe, stay after Putin leaves, because it is based on a narrow number of people, a small number of people, and it is clearly based on very close interrelations that were exploited successfully by Mr. Putin for the recent 20 years. It will be very, very complicated to find some other colonel who could do that, or general who could do that. And they will really need to look hard into for such a person who could use these interrelations like that. I would like to say that one of the key moments of the crisis of Putin regime is that they cannot propose anything more to the country. If the first year of the government of Russia, that was sort of a Soviet Union or image of Soviet Union with sausage, followed by post-Georgian war big empire of Russia, which was expanding. Now, when we, in the post-COVID situation, have returned to the income of household, which is comparable to the year 2008, and there's nothing more to propose. And now we need to create a nice future picture for people, including social policy, to be provided by the opposition, and which should appeal to several very important things. Number one, peace and calmness inside Russia. Okay, Russian people really want authorities to take care of them, and peace on the borders of the country, and the development of a political system, a law enforcement system, which is accountable and clear and accountable to people in general. I believe this will be useful to people and be attractive to people, and lots of support. Thank you. That's it on my behalf.
Thank
you, Mr. Eggert. We still have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers, and I would proceed to the questions. We have questions to Mr. Leonid Volkov, so I will present two of them. The first question from Lilia Shibanova: do you see partners in Russia for fighting the regime together, or are you only going to rely on Navalny teams? And the second question is from Lithuanian political scientist Nerijus Maliukevičius, also to Leonid Volkov. Can you comment on Kremlin's information campaign to discredit Navalny in the West, and how would you comment it? And a related question on Amnesty International's decision to withdraw its designation of Navalny prisoner of conscience. Regarding the question from Lilia Shibanova, the question is very easy. Our partners are any organizations who are willing to oppose Putin and fight Putin. We don't sign memorandums of partnership, so it's not about formal partnerships, but the huge value is doing something together on certain projects. And in many situations, we cooperate with lots of organizations. So on elections, we cooperate with many regional teams of political parties, though Yavlinsky and Zyuganov can say very bad words, but their regional branches can be very suitable for cooperation and coalitions. As far as electoral observation is concerned, we have many partners with whom we cooperate. Regarding the investigations, we also cooperate with many investigative independent journalists. So, of course, we are cooperation-oriented, and the Russian civil society now is very strong, and it's showing its strength. And people contribute by horizontal self-organization, and they are increasingly successful in it. So when for 10,000 detainees, we managed to find attorneys for all of them, and we organize parcels to all of them to prisons, and we repay their fines. Of course, this is a pity that we have to waste such resources and talents for this kind of tasks rather than turning Russia into a flourishing country. But on the other hand, we can really be proud of how good people are in self-organization and horizontal ties. So this was point one. The second question, well, there are many strong organizations in Russia, good in self-organization and doing good things, and we do cooperate with many of them on many issues. Second question, of course, this situation of Navalny daring to survive the poisoning, return to Russia, and release this very painful investigation of the palace makes Putin very angry, and maybe not all understand it. But before that, 99% of resources of Kremlin was spent on fighting our organization. Smart voting was a key threat in line with our organization. But now I think this is also about personal ambition of revenge. And we see this open king stones and these endless attempts, both domestically and externally, this ongoing slander and smear campaign. Finally, Russian federal TVs talk about Navalny around the clock, presenting him as a Nazi, mobilizing children as politicians, stealing, etc. So actually what is happening in the West are very small fractions of this campaign. Mostly it is domestically oriented, because they want to reconvince the Russian citizens to come back to the Russian Orthodox belief after seeing this movie about Putin Palace. Externally, maybe only 3% of this production happens to occur. Maybe the external world is not so used to it, and they are not yet immune to the toxic behavior of communication of Kremlin. This is why West reacts painfully. So Amnesty International just allows them to be deceived. So in our team, well, we have this example. We have 250 people in our team. No one of them would ever click this phishing link in their emails the way Jean Podesta did in 2016, resulting in very painful consequences, because all members of our team receives 10 phishing letters every week. Well, for John Podesta, this was something very new. So this is what I think we should think about this smear campaign. Okay, and the last questions to other panelists. The first questions on sanctions of the European Union against Russia. What do you think about this sanction, and are these sanctions effective? And second, many said recently that Alexei Navalny is a strong leader, and this is what the Russian opposition was lacking, or some other countries were lacking. So now they have the strong leader, brave leader, convincing leader, and importantly, popular leader, compared to maybe Kasyanov. With all respect, this is obviously a popular leader. So now when imprisoned, what will happen to the opposition movement and supporters of Navalny and Russian opposition? Maybe this movement will stop and the protest will stop. So if I may, maybe Mr. Eggert could answer this question.
Прошу прощения, мы вас не слышим.
Да.
Спасибо.
Все вот так. Я хотел просто спросить, речь идет о последнем вопросе по поводу того, что ожидает движение.
So it's about your question on prospects of our movement. Yes, about the prospects of the movement and the EU sanctions against Russia. Well, regarding the prospects of our movement, I believe that Leonid Volkov would be better positioned to speak about it, since he is about organizing the movement, and this is not what I'm doing. But to put it briefly, Navalny and his team are oppositionists #1 in Russia, full stop. Nothing to add on it. Of course, there are some other people who can offer their help, they can join the movement. Leonid said it as well. But there is this intellectual opposition, and the opinion makers, opinion leaders, so they also exist. But after the developments of previous months, for the first time, not only we have opposition in Russia, we have a political figure equivalent to Putin by his political weight, and this is the political fact. Just like the capital of Russia is Moscow. How will it develop? How will Putin try to oppose it? We'll see. And I would add to this point made by Leonid, I believe that this provocation, organized, this was a successful attempt to make Amnesty International to withdraw designation of prisoner of conscience of Navalny, and it was the first relatively successful blow of Kremlin against Navalny in recent months. It was done by leftist pro-communist activists in the US that are in touch with RT, Russian propaganda TV, and it was done with a very clear goal. Thanks to the fact that there was a scandal about Navalny, and Amnesty International, which is an authority for human rights awards around the globe, unfortunately today Navalny's name is partially tarnished. So it was about casting a shadow, and this is unfortunately a blow against the prospect of Navalny to receive international awards, including Nobel Award, for which it is nominated, because These awards are given by gentlemen who are always very serious about reputation and credibility and who are really cautious. So this is one of the countermeasure of Kremlin, which shows that Kremlin is afraid of Navalny, and they see the international authority and international status of Navalny, which is one of the most well-known political prisoner in the world.
Принято в последнее время и то, что мы
In
слышим,
terms of political sanctions, what we hear about, what's done and what will be done by the European Union, it's a dead end. Nobody, no authorities, high-ranking officials are openly going to famous resorts in Europe for vacation. Their property is registered in somebody else's name. And if they go abroad, they use other passports. But I believe nothing will change until the enablers of the regime are revisited, their network is revisited, and their money bags are revisited, money bags of Kremlin. And nothing will happen without it. And we see Mr. Borrell's visit to Kremlin, and all talks about human rights, etc. It's just a cover, covering practical interests. And regarding practical interests and points, we will always find something in common and something to be agreed with other people from the West. Thank you. Mr. Petrov, your opinion, please. I believe we can see different rules of the sanctions. If we believe that the sanctions should change the behaviors of the regime or the country against which they have been passed, then the sanctions we've heard about, even without hearing specific names, they are going to be applied against. They play no role like that at all. And basically, the EU and the West in general have no real pressure gears against such behaviors. However, on the other hand, the moral role of the sanctions and the constantly increasing pressure of the sanctions, they do exist, even though they have no material effect on the regime. And even and the last thing is, I believe that the demonstration of attention of the West to Alexei Navalny personally is very important, because Alexei Navalny has undertaken very high risk, and during his imprisonment, he's always in great danger. And I believe that Mr. Navalny today is the symbol of the opposition now. Russia has no real political opposition, and Kremlin does everything in order not to have one. But again, this has two aspects. On liquidating all the people who could be negotiated with in case of a political crisis, Kremlin is basically shooting their own leg or foot. And it's getting into the situation when the choice is only the survival or the collapse of the regime. And I believe that Mr. Navalny has made a big blow in this respect, which will have its repercussions for a long time, which will lead to the erosion of Mr. Putin and his political regime. Thank you so much, Mr. Andrius Kubilius. The floor is yours. Thank you. I will try not to reiterate. Just in brief about sanctions, I believe we should see a wider picture, larger picture. And in relation to what I've said about the possibilities of the Western world to find ways to defend democracy, I believe that's what we should keep doing together with the US administration. And we should understand that whatever is done by Lukashenko, by Putin in China, it's basically showing muscles to the Western democracy, namely who's stronger or which party is stronger. And it doesn't look that democracies can defend themselves and defend the right of their neighbors against the authoritarian regimes. We need new measures. In terms of Putin's regime, I can quote Vladimir Milva, who is a close co-worker of Mr. Navalny, whom we meet in various workshops. He printed an article saying that sanctions against the regime are effective if they are horizontal, namely if the ones that were introduced after the attack on Ukraine. According to Vladimir Milov's opinion, personal sanctions, namely sanctions against individuals, have no effect against the entire regime, Putin's regime. However, at the same time, they prevent the EU or the West in general to revoke the so-called Ukrainian sanctions. That much about sanctions applicable against individuals. Now, if we're talking about black money or shadow money of oligarchs and other people close to the regime, and we are doing it within our forum and the American Council, relevant council, this point is really raised. And in Washington, they say simply that after the 9/11s, the US have learned on how to counteract terrorism, and they can track all the money that finance terrorists. And they say that the same instruments we should start using against the shadow money of the Russian oligarchs. And we're talking about how the EU should be ready for this and change the rules observed. We're talking, on the other hand, that we should be more civilized in introducing sanctions in the EU in terms of the architecture and in terms of the use of international politics and policies in the EU. And again, it all is translated into the level of separate states of the EU. That is why we don't have sufficient coordination, and we could develop new mechanisms here. And some sanctions, it was said, should be introduced automatically. If the election is stolen and votes are stolen, then such person should be automatically be made subject to such sanctions. And the final point about what sanctions are needed. I believe that whatever is done by Putin's regime is coming closer, resembling Andropov's regime, Brezhnev's regime, if we remember what has been done by the West at that time, we can remember the Jackson-Bannock Amendment, 1970-something. It was introduced by the US. And actually, that was, it had two points, namely the right of the Soviet Jews to migrate out of the Soviet Union and the rights of political prisoners. I don't mean that we should introduce the very same practice, but the mechanism of how it was done and the effect it had, I believe, warrants delving deeper into it from us and actually wider application today. Regarding Alexei Navalny, he's a unique leader. I don't even know whom to compare him by his courage. And he, first of all, has the leading trigger role. He has worked as a trigger in order for the protests to start. But those protests will have an effect on the development of Russia if they get wider, if they're similar to Belarusian ones on open and fair election. And if those protesters who demand serious changes throughout the country, like in Belarus, if those people, those protesters feel the same thing that they felt in Belarus, they could feel that they are the majority. And at that point, they stop fearing Oman and any other oppression. Mr. Putin should actually look at the apartheid in South Africa. And I believe Mr. Navalny in prison could be more dangerous to the regime than out there free. Thank you so much for participating in our roundtable discussion. I hope that we'll keep working on in this format and other one, because the EESC plans to have roundtable discussions every quarter. Thank you so much to all who watched and listened to us. Thank you and good luck.